Every morning, Officer Ryan drove the same quiet stretch of road on the outskirts of town. But one foggy Thursday, a scruffy, limping dog caught his eye, trotting alone, like it had somewhere important to be. Curious, Ryan decided to follow from a distance. He thought maybe it was just lost, maybe hungry. But as the minutes passed and the dog ventured deeper into the woods, something told him this was no ordinary stray. When Ryan finally saw where the dog led him, he dropped to his knees in tears. Every town has its quiet corners, places where life seems to pause, and the only sound is the whisper of wind through trees. For Officer Ryan Keller, that quiet stretch of road on the edge of Pine Hollow had always been one of those places, routine patrols, same fields, same trees. Nothing ever happened there. Until that morning, it was early, just after sunrise. The fog still clung to the grass like a blanket, and Ryan was sipping his lukewarm coffee when something moved at the edge of his vision. A dog. Not just any dog, a medium-sized mutt, all matted fur and tired eyes, limping slowly down the road with a strange sense of purpose. No collar, no leash, no sign of an owner. Just moving. Ryan slowed his cruiser. The dog didn't stop or turn. It simply looked back at him, just once, then kept going. He didn't know why he followed. Instinct maybe, or the way the dog had looked at him. Something about it felt human, like the dog was trying to say something. He didn't radio it in. He didn't want to explain that he was tailing a limping stray through the woods. It sounded ridiculous, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this dog needed him to see something. He followed at a slow distance, not wanting to scare it. The dog kept glancing back, as if to check he was still there. After a few turns, the road disappeared into a worn dirt path, cutting through a dense patch of pine trees. Ryan hesitated. He was off duty in an hour. This wasn't his job, but something inside him tightened. He left the cruiser behind and stepped into the trees. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling, just the soft pad of paws on dirt and the crunch of dry leaves under Ryan's boots. And then, the dog stopped. It stood perfectly still at the edge of a small clearing, its tail low, ears alert. Ryan squinted into the fog ahead, and that's when he saw it, a shape, barely visible at first, then clearer, and what he saw made his throat tighten and his knees buckle beneath him. The dog hadn't just been wandering, it had been leading. Ryan stood frozen for a few seconds, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp forest floor. Before him, partially veiled by the morning mist, sat an old rusted trailer tucked deep into the woods, its faded white paint peeling, one window cracked, another boarded up. Ivy climbed the side like it had been trying to reclaim it for the forest. This was no place anyone stumbled upon by accident. The dog stood still, watching Ryan, its body tense but its eyes pleading. Ryan took a cautious step forward, one hand instinctively resting near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough. He was trained to expect the unexpected, but this was different. The air was thick with something unspoken, and the silence had a strange weight to it. "Is someone here?" he called out, his voice low but firm. No response. He looked down at the dog, which had now sat by the entrance of the trailer, tail wrapped neatly around its paws, gaze fixed on the door. It didn't bark, didn't whine, just waited. Ryan approached the trailer slowly, scanning the surroundings. There were no tire tracks, no sign of fresh footprints, just fallen leaves and overgrown grass. He stepped up onto the creaking wooden steps and knocked on the door. Once, twice. Still nothing. He glanced at the dog again, who hadn't moved an inch. His heart beat faster now, a creeping sense of dread building in his chest. Something was wrong, very wrong. He tested the handle. Unlocked. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a dim, cluttered interior that smelled of damp wood, dust and something else, something metallic and stale. Ryan stepped inside slowly, his hand now firmly gripping the flashlight at his belt. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on a small mattress in the corner, a makeshift table with some canned food, and shelves filled with random knickknacks, old toys, a photo frame turned face down. Then he saw it. In the far corner of the trailer, hidden beneath a heap of blankets, was a small figure. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. He moved closer and gently pulled the top blanket away. A child. A boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, pale and motionless, his chest rising and falling in soft, shallow breaths. His face was smudged with dirt, his hair matted and tangled, and his tiny hands clutched a worn-out stuffed animal. Ryan instinctively dropped to his knees. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice catching. "Can you hear me?" The boy didn't stir, but he was breathing. Thank God, he was breathing. He pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Keller. I need an ambulance at my location ASAP. I've got a child. Male, approximately 6, unconscious but breathing. Location is..." "Hold on." He stepped outside quickly to give them GPS coordinates, rattling them off with a speed and clarity he hadn't known he was capable of. The dog was still there, staring at him with eyes that now seemed softer, relieved even. How did you know?" Ryan murmured, looking at the animal like it might answer. Within minutes, the woods came alive with sound, sirens in the distance, voices crackling over radios. Ryan stayed with the child, gently checking for injuries, offering quiet words of reassurance even though the boy remained unresponsive. Paramedics arrived and carefully lifted the child onto a stretcher. Ryan stepped back, heart pounding, watching the small, fragile form disappear into the back of the ambulance. He gave his report to the medics and the responding officers, but something kept tugging at his mind, something he couldn't explain. It was the dog. While the medics worked, the dog stayed just at the edge of the clearing, watching. As soon as the child was loaded into the ambulance and the door shut, the dog let out a soft, almost mournful whine. Then, quietly, it turned and began to walk away. Ryan didn't hesitate. "Wait," he called, following it again. "Hey, wait, come here." But the dog didn't run. It simply paused, glanced back at him, and continued walking. This time at a slower pace, like it was inviting him to come along once more. Ryan didn't know where this dog had come from, how it had found that trailer, or how long it had been watching over that child, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Ryan followed the dog through the trees, the morning sun finally starting to break through the thick mist. Its golden rays streamed between the branches, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The dog didn't look back again. It just kept moving, weaving confidently through the underbrush, as if it knew exactly where it was going. After about 10 minutes of walking, Ryan's radio crackled. "Officer Keller, do you copy? Ambulance has departed. Child is stable, en route to county hospital." Ryan pressed his mic. "Copy that. I'm on foot following a lead." He didn't elaborate. What was he supposed to say? "I'm tracking a mysterious stray that might be the only witness to whatever just happened here." The trail opened into a rocky incline, and the dog stopped at the top, waiting patiently. Ryan scrambled up after it, brushing off his uniform, and froze when he reached the crest. Below was an abandoned farmhouse, its roof half collapsed, windows shattered, vines overtaking every inch of wood. It looked like it had been empty for years, but something about it felt recent, lived in. The dog descended slowly, ears alert. Ryan followed more cautiously, hand resting on his flashlight again. He could feel it now, that tight sensation in his chest that usually preceded something big. His instincts had rarely failed him. As he approached the front door, he noticed a strange marking carved into the wood. It looked like initials, Etukanram, scratched in clumsily, almost like a child had done it. Below it, a series of smaller lines and numbers. Ryan jotted it down in his notebook, then pushed the door open. The smell hit him first. Musty, damp wood, but layered with something more acrid. Mildew, maybe, or rot. The inside was dark, the boards groaning under his weight. He stepped in slowly, sweeping his flashlight from left to right. It wasn't empty. Blankets on the floor, an old cot, food wrappers, cans, a broken lamp. Someone had been staying here recently, maybe even last night. And in the corner, another blanket, small and rumpled, with what looked like a child's drawing lying beside it. Ryan picked it up. It showed a stick figure of a boy, a sun in the sky, and next to him the dog, black fur, pointed ears, just like the one outside. Suddenly, it all started connecting. This wasn't random. That child hadn't just wandered into a trailer in the woods. He'd been taken there or hidden, and this dog hadn't found him by accident. It had known him. Ryan stepped outside again, the drawing still in his hand. The dog was sitting by the front steps now, tail thumping lightly, watching him with calm, intelligent eyes. "You knew him, didn't you?" Ryan said quietly. "You were protecting him." The dog didn't move, didn't bark, just looked at him. But somehow that was answer enough. Ryan crouched down, holding the drawing out. "Is this you?" The dog's gaze flicked from the paper to Ryan, then back to the house. It stood, walked a few steps toward the side of the house, and sat again, waiting. Ryan followed. Around the side, he noticed a patch of freshly disturbed earth. It was subtle, but in his line of work, small things often screamed the loudest. Something had been buried here. He knelt beside the patch and gently began to clear the leaves. There, beneath the surface, was a small pile of objects. A torn child's shoe, a baby blanket, a broken collar with a name tag, a Lucky. Ryan's breath hitched. He turned to the dog, who now stood solemnly beside him. "Your name's Lucky." The dog didn't respond, of course, but Ryan felt the answer in his gut. He looked back at the items, his mind spinning. Lucky had been living out here, surviving. Not just surviving, but protecting a child who, for reasons unknown, had been hidden deep in the woods, far from any town or road. But why? Ryan pulled out his radio again. "Dispatch, I need an evidence unit at my location. I've got a possible secondary scene, abandoned structure, signs of occupancy, and buried personal effects. I'm also requesting animal control, but make sure they're gentle. This dog is more than just a stray." As he waited for the backup, Ryan sat down on the porch steps next to Lucky. The dog leaned gently against his leg, and for a moment, the forest was silent again. A boy found alone in the woods, a trailer no one knew existed, an abandoned house filled with signs of recent life, and a dog that had somehow led him to all of it. It was only the beginning. The evidence team arrived just after noon, winding their way through the forest with quiet urgency. Ryan met them at the edge of the clearing, where Lucky waited silently at his side like a seasoned partner. The techs quickly moved to photograph and catalog the items found near the farmhouse, while others carefully documented the interior. But Ryan's mind was still spinning. He stood near the old swing hanging from a branch, its rope frayed but still swaying gently in the breeze, staring at the horizon. That image of the drawing was burned into his memory. The boy, the sun, and Lucky. But something else had begun to itch at the back of his mind. "Officer Keller," one of the evidence techs called. "You'll want to see this." He stepped into the farmhouse again, this time to the back room. A small crawl space had been uncovered beneath a loose floorboard. Inside were several items wrapped in plastic. A child's backpack, a weathered journal, and, most disturbing of all, a stack of photographs. Ryan crouched and flipped through them carefully. Some were innocent, a child playing in a backyard, smiling. Others were more troubling. The same child, clearly the one they found that morning, looking frightened, sitting in what looked like the trailer's bed. And then there was a photo that made Ryan's stomach drop. It was of the boy, with a man, late 40s, scruffy beard, narrow eyes. Standing behind the child with a forced smile, one hand on his shoulder, Ryan clenched his jaw. He handed the photo to one of the detectives. "We need facial recognition on this guy. Now." While they scanned the image and uploaded it to the state database, Ryan stepped outside. Lucky followed, pausing only briefly to glance back at the trailer. Ryan crouched down and scratched behind Lucky's ear. "You were with him the whole time, weren't you?" Lucky tilted his head slightly, then sat back down beside him, eyes fixed on the tree line. There was a tension in the dog's body, like it knew something else was coming. Minutes later, his radio crackled. "Keller, we got a hit. The man in the photo is Thomas Mero, ex-con, did 5 years for kidnapping, released on parole last year. No known address, no employer, but flagged recently in connection with a missing persons report. That boy, his name's Eli, was abducted 3 weeks ago." Ryan's breath left his body like a punch to the gut. 3 weeks, in those woods. The voice on the other end continued. "We're sending updated files to your email now. And Keller, Mero is considered armed and dangerous. Proceed with caution. Ryan looked down at Lucky. You led me to that boy, before anyone even knew where to look. How did you know? And it hit him suddenly. Lucky hadn't just found the child, and he had escaped with him, or had tried to. That collar, the buried items, maybe they had belonged to others. Or maybe Lucky had once belonged to Mero himself, but something in him had turned, some loyalty to the child stronger than fear. Ryan stood and looked out at the woods again. He's still out here, he whispered. And Lucky knows it. The realization was like lightning. Ryan turned to the others. I want a perimeter sweep within 2 miles. Check for trails, footprints, disturbed vegetation, anything. Mero might still be close. And if he sees all this activity, he could panic. The team mobilized quickly. Ryan stayed close to Lucky, who paced near the edge of the trees, nose twitching, tail stiff. Then Lucky growled, a low, steady sound. Ryan followed his gaze. Deep in the woods, just beyond a ridge, a dark shape darted between the trees. Fast, too fast to be a deer. Hold your positions! Ryan shouted. He sprinted forward, heart hammering, flashlight bouncing against his side. Lucky bolted ahead, barking now, charging through the underbrush with terrifying precision. They reached the ridge and stopped. Ahead was a creek, and on the other side, fresh tracks, boots, heading north. Lucky was already crossing, splashing through the shallow water without hesitation. Ryan radioed in. I have eyes on a possible suspect fleeing north of the farmhouse. On foot. Pursuing with K9 unit. Unofficial, but trust me, he knows what he's doing. He caught up with Lucky on the other side and continued after the trail. Every branch seemed to claw at him, every step louder than he wanted it to be. But Lucky moved like he was built for this, tracking something he'd been waiting weeks to find again. Ryan didn't say it out loud, but he knew it in his bones. This dog wasn't just a witness, he was a rescuer. And now, he was leading Ryan straight into the lion's den. Ryan's lungs burned as he ran, twigs snapping beneath his boots, the forest blurring past him in streaks of green and brown. Lucky was a dark blur just ahead, his movements quick but careful, nose to the ground, following the invisible trail with laser focus. Every so often, the dog paused to reassess, then sprinted forward again with renewed urgency. Ryan had never seen anything like it. This wasn't some random chase. Lucky knew who they were following. He had history with the man they were hunting. Of that, Ryan was now sure. And from the way the dog was pushing forward, tail low and focused, this wasn't fear guiding him, it was determination. As they neared a dense grove, Ryan slowed, raising a hand instinctively, though no one was behind him. He paused to listen. Silence, then crunch. Ryan dropped to a crouch and scanned the trees. Something or someone was moving just beyond the clearing. Lucky stiffened at his side, his growl barely audible now, but his body was taut like a coiled spring. Ryan reached for his sidearm, but didn't draw it. Not yet. He moved closer, slow and silent. Lucky mirrored his steps like a trained partner. Through the branches, Ryan finally caught sight of movement. A man, grimy, unshaven, clothes torn and filthy, was dragging something from behind a fallen log. A tarp. Beneath it, what looked like bags or supplies, it was him, Thomas Mero. Ryan's grip on the radio tightened, but he didn't press the button. Mero hadn't seen him yet. He could wait. But Lucky had other plans. Before Ryan could whisper a command, the dog surged forward with a deep, resonant bark. Mero spun around, startled, eyes wide, and for a split second, Ryan saw fear. "Lucky?" Mero's voice cracked, a mix of disbelief and rage. "You followed me?" The dog didn't charge. He stopped just feet away, barking fiercely, holding the man in place. Ryan took that chance. "Pine Hollow Police! Hands where I can see them!" Mero stumbled backward, eyes darting between the dog and the officer. "This isn't what it looks like," he said quickly, raising his hands. "The kid, I was protecting him. His mom, she left him. I took him because no one else cared." Ryan didn't lower his weapon. "That child was dehydrated and unconscious. You left him alone in a trailer miles from civilization." "He was safe," Mero barked back. "I made sure of it." "No," Ryan cut in, voice hard. "Lucky made sure of it, not you." The man's face twisted, first in confusion, then in bitter recognition. "That mutt," he spat. "Always in the way, always running off." Lucky growled low, stepping closer, the tension in his shoulders unrelenting. Mero took a desperate step back, then bolted. Ryan gave chase immediately. Keller in pursuit, suspect fleeing northeast, unarmed but dangerous. Mero wasn't fast, but he was wild, slamming through brush, taking unpredictable turns. Lucky darted ahead, flanking him, cutting off his path like he knew the forest better than Mero ever could. Finally, at the edge of a steep ravine, Mero stumbled. His foot caught a root and he collapsed hard, skidding into the dirt. Ryan was on him in seconds, cuffs snapping tight around his wrists. Mero shouted and thrashed, but Ryan's voice cut through like steel. "Enough! It's over." Lucky stood at a short distance, chest heaving, tail still as stone. As officers arrived to take Mero into custody, Ryan knelt beside Lucky. "You did good," he said softly, brushing dirt from the dog's fur. "You saved him." Lucky didn't wag his tail. He just sat, eyes focused on the ravine as if still watching, still guarding. Back at the station, the pieces began falling into place. Thomas Mero had kidnapped Eli from a neighboring town weeks earlier. No one knew exactly why. His story was inconsistent. Sometimes he claimed the boy was his son. Sometimes he said he was rescuing him from an abusive home. But one thing was clear. Lucky had been there the entire time. At some point, whether due to instinct, loyalty, or something deeper, the dog had broken free, guiding Officer Ryan to the child, then to the man who had taken him. And when the detectives ran Lucky's microchip, yes, he had one, it told another story. Lucky had once belonged to Eli's family. He'd been their dog. And when Eli disappeared, so had Lucky. The discovery that Lucky was, in fact, Eli's family dog shifted everything. What had seemed like a chance encounter between a cop and a stray transformed into something far deeper. Something rooted in loyalty, loss, and perhaps fate. For Officer Ryan Keller, it stirred an ache he hadn't felt in years, a reminder of the kind of bond that defies logic. But the sense of resolution didn't last long. That night, back at the station, Ryan sat alone in the evidence room, reviewing the files that had come in since Mero's arrest. A copy of Eli's missing persons report lay open in front of him. The boy's school photo clipped to the top, his eyes, full of innocence and curiosity, now held an entirely new weight. According to the initial timeline, Eli had disappeared from his backyard during an unremarkable Saturday afternoon. His mother had stepped inside for just a moment, just long enough for the gate to swing open. Security cameras from the nearby block had picked up Mero's truck idling 2 streets away. Within 20 minutes, both Eli and Lucky were gone. But what troubled Ryan wasn't just what had happened. It was how no one had found them sooner. The trailer, the farmhouse, the trail Lucky had led him through, none of it showed up in satellite imagery. The buildings were old, possibly dating back to before local property records were digitized. They sat in a kind of legal limbo, unnoticed, unclaimed. But what if they hadn't been so random after all? Ryan reached for a second file, one that had just been delivered from county archives. Inside were several missing children reports, going back 15 years. A few of them shared eerie similarities. Children taken from quiet neighborhoods, no ransom demands, no arrests, and in each case, no trace of the child ever found. He felt a chill creep up his spine as he laid the reports side by side. The locations, the method, the silence afterward, it was a pattern, buried in time. Could Mero have been connected to more than just Eli? Ryan leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He'd known darkness in his career, but this felt personal. Lucky's intervention had saved one child, but how many hadn't been so lucky? The thought made his jaw tighten. The next morning, Ryan returned to the hospital to check on Eli. The boy was awake now, barely speaking, but alert. His mother sat by his bedside, her hand gently stroking his hair. She looked up when Ryan entered and offered a quiet, tearful smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. You brought him back to me." Ryan shook his head slowly. "I didn't." "He did." He gestured to the door, where Lucky now sat patiently, tail thumping against the floor. The boy's face lit up, dimly but genuinely. as he saw the dog. With effort, Eli pushed himself up and reached toward him. Lucky padded over gently and rested his head on the edge of the bed. Eli buried his fingers in the dog's fur, holding on as though afraid he'd vanish again. It was a quiet, powerful moment, one that Ryan would carry with him for the rest of his life. But even as he watched the reunion, his mind stayed busy. Mero was in custody, but he wasn't talking, and something told Ryan he wouldn't, not easily. Back at the station, detectives were already trying to link him to other disappearances, but the lack of evidence was frustrating. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. It was as if Mero had moved through the woods like a ghost, careful, methodical, and worst of all, he had picked locations no one would think to search. Ryan returned to the farmhouse with a team later that afternoon, hoping to find anything they might have missed. The crawl space had been cleared, and the surrounding forest swept, but something nagged at him. He asked the team to bring in ground-penetrating radar, usually reserved for homicide scenes or buried remains. Hours passed with no results. Then, just before dusk, the scanner pinged. 6 feet from the old swing, beneath the moss and pine needles, lay a series of shallow disturbances. The radar showed outlines, small, irregular, human-sized. They dug carefully, silently. The air shifted around them as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. By the time they were done, they had uncovered the remains of 3 small children, each one carefully wrapped and buried. Ryan stood over the scene, eyes locked on the turned earth, the horror unfolding piece by piece. His throat tightened. Lucky stood a few steps behind, quiet, still. His eyes didn't leave the spot. Mero hadn't just taken Eli. He had done this before, and now, Ryan knew, Eli and Lucky had survived what others hadn't. They had escaped the hands of a man who thought no one would ever find them. They were the only voices left to tell the story. The silence in the woods after the last body was uncovered was unbearable. Even the birds seemed to have vanished, as though the forest itself was grieving. Officer Ryan stood motionless beside the fresh excavation, the scent of damp soil and decaying wood clinging to the air. The coroner team worked in quiet coordination, carefully lifting the tiny, cloth-wrapped remains from the ground as the forensic photographers documented everything. It was methodical, clinical, necessary. But to Ryan, it felt like desecration. Not because the work was wrong, because it should never have been necessary in the first place. His chest tightened. How many times had he driven this perimeter in the last year? How many patrols through this very forest? He had passed within miles of this place, never once suspecting that children were buried beneath his feet. Lucky sat beside him once again, unmoving, as if he too felt the weight of every lost life. His ears twitched only slightly at the hum of equipment and the murmurs of investigators. Occasionally, he glanced up at Ryan, not for direction but for reassurance, or maybe to give it. And for the first time, Ryan found himself questioning whether he even deserved that loyalty. Later that night, after the scene was cleared and the area roped off, Ryan drove back in silence. Lucky curled up in the passenger seat, like he had always belonged there. The ride was long, slow, heavy. His thoughts churned. He couldn't get the image of those shallow graves out of his head, nor could he stop thinking about Eli, how close the boy had come to joining them. If Lucky hadn't escaped, hadn't led Ryan through those woods. He clenched the steering wheel tighter. What haunted him most wasn't just the horror of the crimes. It was the system that had failed, the blind spots, the forgotten properties, the unanswered reports, and the knowledge that Mero had lived right under their noses for who knows how long. At the station, he filed his final report of the day and walked back out to the car. Lucky was waiting, tail wagging softly. The gesture was small, but it broke something in Ryan. He crouched down beside the dog, burying his fingers in his fur, resting his forehead against Lucky's shoulder. "I should have seen this coming," he murmured. "I should have found them, all of them." Lucky didn't move. He just stayed there, solid, warm, alive. In that moment, Ryan wasn't a cop. He was just a man, one who had witnessed something too big to carry alone. And Lucky wasn't just a dog. He was the only soul who understood the depth of what had been lost. The next day, Ryan visited Eli again at the hospital. The boy was sitting up now, weak but alert, a tray of untouched food beside him. His mother stepped out to give them a moment, and Ryan took a seat by the bed. Eli watched him quietly, holding Lucky's collar in one hand. The dog wasn't allowed inside, but the hospital staff had made an exception to let him in for brief moments at a time. It had become part of Eli's therapy, one of the only things that soothed him. Ryan cleared his throat. "Hey, champ." Eli didn't answer, but he blinked slowly, acknowledging him. "I wanted to ask you something," Ryan said softly. "Do you remember anything about the place he took you?" Eli's eyes drifted to the window. Then, slowly, he nodded. "It was dark," the boy whispered. "Cold. He told me my mom didn't want me anymore, that I had to stay quiet or she'd forget me faster." Ryan felt his stomach drop. "And Lucky?" he asked. Eli's eyes warmed slightly. "He stayed with me. Every night. He'd sleep next to me, and when I got scared, he'd lick my face." Ryan swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "Did he ever leave?" Eli shook his head. "Only once. I think he went to find someone." Ryan nodded slowly. So Lucky had escaped. He chose to go. Not out of fear, but out of hope. Out of love. Eli reached out and touched Ryan's sleeve. "Are there more kids?" he asked, his voice barely above a breath. Ryan hesitated. He wanted to lie. He wanted to protect the boy from the truth, but he couldn't. "Yes," he said gently. "But we found them, and now no other kids will get hurt because of you and because of Lucky." Eli didn't cry. He just nodded, slowly. A network error occurred. "Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help@openai.com. The days that followed unfolded like waves, slow at first, then crashing with the force of years' worth of missed warnings, overlooked patterns, and questions that no one wanted to ask out loud. The discovery of the graves in the woods had sent ripples across the county, and suddenly, the quiet forest outside Pine Hollow was at the center of a sprawling investigation that reached far beyond the town's borders. Ryan had expected attention, but not the suffocating pressure that came with it. Reporters circling the station like vultures, federal agents combing through every piece of Mero's history, and grieving families demanding answers for children who had vanished without a trace. His phone rang constantly now. Each call either another lead, another demand, or another impossible weight placed on his shoulders. But through it all, one thing remained constant: Lucky. The dog, ever quiet, ever watchful, had become something of a legend within the department in just a matter of days. Officers greeted him with solemn nods, and even the most hardened detectives softened when he walked by. Ryan had brought him in as a companion, a witness, a rescuer, but now he was something else too, a symbol. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long, amber shadows across the precinct parking lot, Ryan stood outside beside Lucky, a file tucked under his arm. His eyes scanned the tree line in the distance, the same woods that had swallowed so many lives and nearly taken one more. The cool wind carried the scent of pine and memory. He knelt down beside Lucky and sighed. "So you know we're not done yet, right?" The dog simply looked at him, those deep, unwavering eyes full of quiet knowing. Ryan smiled faintly, then rose and headed back inside. He had just received something that changed everything. It was a letter. An anonymous envelope had arrived that morning, addressed to Officer Keller, confidential. Inside was a single sheet of paper, no fingerprints, no name, just a typed message that made Ryan's skin crawl. The cabin was only one of the places he used. "If you're reading this, you've only seen part of the truth. There are more. Follow the symbol." Attached to the letter was a sketch, crude but unmistakable. It was the same carved symbol he'd seen on the farmhouse door, TM, and beneath it, a set of numbers. But now, the sketch included something else. A small triangle inside a circle, a symbol Ryan hadn't noticed before. He spread out the maps on his desk, marking the coordinates from the cabin and comparing them to the ones from the letter. Slowly, a pattern began to form. Not just a cluster, but a path. The farmhouse, the trailer, and now two more locations that lined up with the coordinates. The possibility hit him like a thunderclap. This wasn't random. Mero hadn't just hidden in forgotten properties. He had chosen them, arranged them, This was a system, a pattern, maybe even a network, and the triangle in circle symbol, it was familiar. Ryan had seen it before, deep in an old report from years ago. A closed case involving a suspected cult in upstate New York. Abductions, strange symbols, a network of rural safe houses. It had been dismissed as paranoia at the time. Nothing stuck, no arrests. But now it felt like a thread begging to be pulled. He immediately called in one of the department analysts and requested access to all missing persons reports tied to known wilderness structures, abandoned cabins, trailers, off-grid compounds in the surrounding counties. Then, he pulled the old cult file from archives and spread the documents across the table like puzzle pieces. It was Lucky who snapped him out of his focus. The dog had risen from his resting spot in the corner and was now standing by the window, ears perked, tail still. Ryan followed his gaze. A dark car idled across the street, windows tinted, engine running, too far to see the plates, but close enough to be watching. When Ryan stepped toward the window, the car pulled away. Coincidence or warning? He picked up the phone and ordered extra surveillance around the station and his own home. Whatever Mero had been part of, Ryan was beginning to suspect he hadn't worked alone. And someone out there didn't like that the investigation was still moving. As the night settled in, Ryan sat with Lucky at his side, maps and files spread around them. He could feel it now, in his bones, that this wasn't over, that the child he'd saved was just one branch on a much darker tree, and that Lucky, somehow, had been the key not just to unlocking one mystery, but to shining light on something far more dangerous. There were more children out there, and time was running out. The next few days were a blur of movement, suspicion, and whispered theories, of half-formed truths that twisted themselves around old reports, archived files, and memories too painful for most to revisit. Ryan barely slept. His desk, once clean and orderly, had become a battlefield of open folders, overlapping maps, printouts of satellite imagery, and grainy photographs of properties that no one had thought to care about, until now. What disturbed him most wasn't the darkness of what they were uncovering, it was how quiet that darkness had been. These were not crimes of passion or desperation, they were methodical, rehearsed, practiced. Ryan had asked one of the younger officers, a bright analyst named Marissa, to help him trace the coordinates from the mysterious letter. She was sharp, precise, and had a personal interest in cold cases, especially those involving missing children. Her younger sister had vanished 10 years earlier during a summer camping trip, and though her case had long been declared cold, Marissa never really accepted it. Ryan hadn't known that part of her story until now. And when he showed her the crude triangle in circle symbol, she froze. "I've seen this before," she whispered, sifting through her notes, "not just in that cult file. It was carved into the tree near the last spot my sister was seen. No one thought it mattered. They said it was just graffiti." Her voice cracked slightly, but she caught herself. Ryan looked at her carefully. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." She shook her head, eyes focused now. "Don't be. Just help me bring this thing down." Together, they plotted the symbols onto a larger regional map. What emerged was a jagged arc, sweeping through 3 counties, each point aligning eerily with locations tied to past disappearances. Some had been attributed to runaways, others to unknown causes, and many were just quietly forgotten. But now, looking at them this way, the connections were undeniable. At the center of the arc was an unmarked zone of forest, government-owned land with no current development and no formal trails. It was land most people avoided, not because it was dangerous, but because it felt off. Locals called it the Hollow. Ryan hated the name instantly. He stared at the map for a long time, the lines forming a crude constellation of suffering, and couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Meanwhile, Lucky's behavior had shifted. He still followed Ryan everywhere, still lay near his feet as he worked, but now he was more alert, more restless. He'd pace at night, ears twitching, nose pressed to doors and windows. Twice, he'd growled at nothing, waking Ryan from a brief, fitful sleep. It was as if he felt the tension growing, or worse, he sensed something moving. Ryan began reviewing Mero's interrogations again. The man had said very little since his arrest, but one phrase stood out, spoken quietly during a late-night session, when Ryan had pushed a little too hard. "I wasn't the only one," Mero had muttered, eyes hollow. "There were others. I kept mine safe." Ryan hadn't known what to make of it then. Now it chilled him. He asked Marissa to re-interview Mero, believing she might get further than the detectives had. She was sharp, composed, but not hardened, and sometimes that humanity could break down walls. To everyone's surprise, it worked. Mero opened up, but only slightly. He didn't give names, didn't give numbers, but he confirmed what they feared. He hadn't been acting alone. "There's a place," he said softly, staring at the table, "deep in the hollow. You won't find it unless it wants to be found. That's where they go, the ones who don't belong." Marissa frowned. "Who doesn't belong?" Mero just smiled. And for a moment, Ryan could swear he saw pride behind that broken gaze. "The forgotten ones," he whispered, "the ones nobody misses." After the interview, Marissa returned to Ryan, her face pale but steady. He didn't lie. "At least, not all of it." Ryan nodded slowly. "Then we go into the hollow." She hesitated. "You think it's still active?" "I think it never stopped," Ryan replied. "And I think lucky brought us this far for a reason." That night, Ryan drove to the edge of the forest and parked near the old trailhead, one that had long since been covered with brush. He opened the passenger door, and Lucky jumped out without needing a command. The dog sniffed the air, then looked at Ryan with something close to certainty. They weren't done. The past wasn't buried, and someone, or something, was waiting for them deep in the trees. The entrance to the hollow wasn't marked by any sign or structure. There were no trails, no warning posts, no boundaries. It was simply where the trees grew thicker, darker, where the wind seemed to hush, and even the birdsong died out entirely. The locals called it cursed, a place where compasses spun and voices didn't echo. Ryan had always chalked that up to superstition, until now. He stepped past the last visible edge of the known trail, boots crunching softly over a bed of leaves untouched by hikers or forest rangers. Lucky stayed close, ears alert, body low. Every few feet, the dog paused, sniffed, then chose a direction, always certain, always forward. Behind them, 2 search and rescue officers followed at a distance, one holding a thermal scanner, the other carrying a satellite beacon. Ryan had insisted on bringing them, not only for backup, but because if what Mero had said was true, they couldn't afford to lose their way. The forest was dense, disorienting, and there were already documented cases of people entering and never coming back. The deeper they went, the stranger things felt. The light dimmed even though the sky was clear. A chill crept under Ryan's collar, though the air wasn't cold. There was no wildlife, not a bird, not a squirrel, not even an insect hum. It was like the forest had forgotten how to breathe. "Officer Keller," one of the search team members whispered, "we're losing signal, satellites dropping out." "Mark your last location and keep moving," Ryan replied, voice steady but tight. "We're not stopping now." They walked for nearly an hour, twisting through trees that all looked the same, until Lucky suddenly stopped at a gnarled cedar that stood out among the pines. The dog sniffed the base, then began to circle, tail stiff. Ryan knelt and examined the bark. Carved into the trunk, faint, nearly faded, was the same triangle-in-circle symbol from the letter. Beneath it, initials, not T, M, this time, but G, R. Another name, another piece of the web. Lucky barked once, sharp and deliberate, then turned and began walking again, this time uphill. They reached a ridge just as dusk began to settle, and that's when they saw it. Below, partially obscured by the rising mist, was a small compound, not a cabin, not a trailer. A compound. 3 structures, built from old timber and corrugated metal, sat in a clearing surrounded by crude fencing made from scavenged parts. There were no lights, no signs of life, but the place wasn't abandoned. From their vantage point, Ryan could see signs of recent use: stacked firewood, a clothesline with fresh fabric, and, most telling of all, a faint wisp of smoke curling from the largest building. He lowered himself and motioned to the others to stay low. Lucky crouched beside him, eyes fixed on the center cabin. "Thermal's got something," whispered one of the officers. Three signatures. Inside the main structure." Ryan's pulse quickened. If there were people still here, they had to move fast. There was no knowing what they were doing, or whether anyone was in immediate danger, but then he saw it. Movement. A small figure emerged from one of the buildings, tiny, unsteady, a child. He stepped into the clearing, holding something in his hands, barefoot and thin, no more than 7 years old. His clothes were ragged. He turned and looked directly up toward the ridge, right at them. Ryan's breath caught. "He saw us," one officer whispered. "No," Ryan said, eyes narrowing. "He knows we're here." Before they could act, a loud bang shattered the silence, a door flying open. A man stormed into the clearing, grabbing the child by the arm and shouting something unintelligible. The boy didn't resist. He simply let the object in his hand fall to the ground as he was dragged back inside. It was a stuffed animal. Ryan clenched his jaw. "We're moving," he said, already sliding down the ridge. "Now!" Lucky charged ahead, his barks echoing like war drums through the forest. Ryan followed, gun drawn, heart pounding, every step louder than the last. He didn't know what kind of people they were about to face. He didn't care. What mattered was that another child was in danger, and this time, there would be no more waiting. The descent from the ridge was steep, treacherous, and riddled with roots that threatened to twist underfoot, but Ryan didn't slow down for a second. The moment he saw the boy in the clearing, thin, frightened, and dragged like a piece of discarded cloth, something inside him shifted, a resolve hardening into something far fiercer than duty. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. This was justice. This was reckoning. Lucky was already ahead, his body a blur of black fur weaving between trees and fallen limbs, his bark sharp and rhythmic like a call to arms. Behind them, the two officers did their best to keep pace, their breathing quickening under the strain of both adrenaline and terrain. But Ryan barely noticed. Every step pounded with the same thought. No more children. Not one more. As they neared the compound, Ryan held up a fist, signaling the team to stop. He crouched behind a tree, breathing hard, and scanned the perimeter. From here, he could hear voices now, muffled but heated. There was more than one man inside, possibly 3, and the boy, still alive. That had to be enough. He turned to the others, voice low but firm, his words coming in deliberate, steady waves. "We breach the main structure first. We go silent until we reach the threshold. If the child is inside, priority is extraction. No warning shots, no hesitation. They've already crossed every line." The younger officer nodded, jaw tight. The second adjusted his grip on the rifle, lips pressed in a grim line. Lucky stood at the cabin's edge now, his body low, one paw raised, tail rigid, his muscles tensed like a bowstring. Ryan watched him for a beat, then rose and advanced. The compound's outer fencing gave little resistance, just rusted wire and broken wood. They slipped through, then made their way to the main building. The air was thick now with smoke and something metallic. Maybe burnt meat, maybe oil. Ryan didn't want to know. He reached the side of the building, motioned for the others to flank left and right, and raised his hand. 3, 2, 1. He kicked in the door with a single, brutal strike. Inside, chaos erupted. The room was dim, lit only by an old oil lamp swinging wildly from a ceiling hook. 2 men scrambled to their feet, one reaching for something under the table, the other lunging toward a side door. Ryan shouted, "Police!" "Don't move," as he swept the room, catching sight of the boy huddled in the far corner. His knees pulled to his chest, eyes wide and unblinking. But before he could act, a gunshot rang out. One of the suspects had fired blindly, his hand shaking as he ducked behind an overturned chair. Ryan dove for cover, returning fire just wide enough to pin the man down. The other officer on the left flank breached from the side, shouting orders as he secured the second suspect, who had dropped his weapon and hit the floor. The firefight lasted less than 20 seconds, but felt like a lifetime. When the noise finally stopped, the cabin was filled with smoke, splintered wood and the smell of gunpowder. One man was down, wounded but breathing. The other was in cuffs. Ryan moved quickly to the corner, kneeling in front of the boy, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "It's okay. You're safe now. We've got you." The child didn't speak, but his trembling hands reached for Ryan's vest, clutching it with desperate strength. Ryan scooped him up, blanket and all, holding him tight against his chest as he stood and turned toward the doorway. That's when he noticed Lucky, still standing just outside, ears back, body frozen. Ryan stepped forward slowly, eyes following the dog's gaze, and then he saw her. Another child, barely older than Eli, emerging from behind the second structure, thin, barefoot, silent as a ghost. She didn't cry, didn't run, she just stared. Behind her movement, another shape and then another, 3 children, all walking slowly toward the sound of the gunfire, drawn by the disruption, the light, the hope of something finally breaking through. Ryan's breath caught in his chest. They hadn't just found another hiding place, they had found a prison. He turned to the officers behind him. "Radio in, we have multiple child rescues. Repeat, multiple. We need medics, trauma support, child welfare teams. Everyone." As the officers moved to secure the perimeter, Ryan knelt beside Lucky again, eyes full of disbelief and awe. "You brought us here," he said softly. "You brought us to all of them." Lucky leaned in, pressing his head gently to Ryan's shoulder. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Ryan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of the end. The rescue operation unfolded in a blur of flashing lights, urgent voices, and the whir of rotor blades slicing through the air as a medevac helicopter descended just beyond the tree line. The once silent forest, which had hidden so many unspeakable secrets, now roared with life and movement. Dozens of officers moving in coordinated precision, trauma teams setting up field triage units, and caseworkers gently coaxing frightened children into blankets and safe arms. Ryan stood in the center of it all, motionless for a moment, his gaze scanning the clearing with a strange sense of detachment. Around him, the children, now 5 in total, were being treated and accounted for, each one emerging like a ghost from the shadows of captivity into a world that had all but forgotten them. And yet, despite the relief, despite the success of the raid, he couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest, that sense that they were still standing at the edge of something deeper. He watched as Lucky moved among the children, not barking or wagging, but quietly present, his steps slow, deliberate, his gaze lingering on each small face as if counting, making sure none were missing. One girl reached out, fingers trembling, and placed a hand on his back. Lucky didn't flinch. He leaned into her, as if he knew the weight of the silence she carried. And it was in that moment, watching the wounded, the found, the barely healing, that Ryan realized something else entirely. This wasn't the end. This was the surface. After ensuring the children were safe, fed and wrapped in emergency thermal blankets, Ryan pulled Marissa aside, who had arrived minutes earlier in a second wave of personnel. Her face, pale and tight with tension, softened briefly when she spotted the children, but her eyes turned hard again as Ryan handed her the latest file they had uncovered inside one of the shacks. A thin, leather-bound notebook filled with names, dates, and symbols. Some names were crossed out, others were not. "This is a ledger," Ryan said quietly, his voice low and controlled despite the storm beneath it. "It's not just a record of who was here, it's a manifest." Marissa flipped through the pages, her hands shaking slightly as she read. The handwriting was crude, but meticulous. Some names had initials, some had only ages, some were labeled with strange symbols, geometric shapes, runes, numbers in parentheses. She looked up at him, face pale. "How many?" Ryan took a breath. 27. "That we can read. And the others?" she asked, voice barely a whisper. "We don't know. Some pages are damaged, maybe intentionally. There are codes we don't understand, but based on what we've seen so far, it's possible these were drop points, transit hubs. Like this place wasn't just where they kept the kids, it's where they moved them." The thought landed like a blow. If that was true, then the horror didn't end here. This place, this compound, was just one spoke on a wheel that might have been turning for years, maybe decades, without anyone ever noticing. Lucky let out a single, low bark, breaking the silence. Ryan turned to see him standing at the edge of the tree line, nose to the wind again, tail still. It was the same posture he'd taken outside the farmhouse, the same silent alert. Ryan followed, pushing past brush and branches until he reached the spot where Lucky had stopped. The dog's nose was pressed into the dirt, sniffing a trail that led away from the compound, deeper into the hollow, into territory even the rescue teams hadn't reached. Ryan knelt down beside him, fingers brushing over the disturbed soil. It was faint, but unmistakable. Tire tracks. Recent, large. He stood and called over Marissa, pointing. "Someone left not long ago?" She frowned. "Survivors? Or handlers?" Ryan muttered. "Either way, we didn't get them all." He turned to one of the tactical team leaders nearby. "I want surveillance drones in the air within the hour, and a K9 unit sweeping that path. I know we've got our hands full here, but we can't let this trail go cold." The man nodded and moved quickly to coordinate. As Ryan turned back to the compound, the final weight of what they had uncovered began to settle into his bones. Not just the children they had saved, but the children not here. The ones in the ledger without names, the ones not crossed out, the ones still out there. Lucky returned to his side, brushing his shoulder against Ryan's leg like an anchor, a reminder that they hadn't failed, but also that they hadn't yet finished. And as the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, Ryan made himself a quiet, solemn promise. No matter how far they had to go, no matter what was waiting in the hollow's darkest corners, they would not stop. Not until every last child was brought home. The forest was utterly still. Not the kind of peaceful silence one might associate with nature's calm, but the kind that presses in on the eardrums, that hums with a dreadful tension just beneath the surface, like a held breath that stretches beyond its limit. A silence not of serenity, but of anticipation. Ryan stood at the edge of that silence, gazing into the darkness ahead where Lucky's nose had traced the last known direction of those tire tracks. Tracks that, unlike the chaos they'd uncovered in the compound, suggested escape, premeditation, continuity. Behind him, the now secured clearing bustled with floodlights and controlled voices, a makeshift command post orchestrating the extraction of children and suspects. But ahead, beyond the reach of artificial light and safe protocols, lay something far less defined, something Ryan could only describe as unfinished business. He could feel it now, not just the pressure of unresolved questions, but the unmistakable weight of implication that what they had uncovered was not a final destination, not the denouement of a twisted crime, but rather the peeling back of a curtain, the opening chapter of a truth long buried under silence, bureaucracy and willful blindness. He turned to Marissa, who stood beside him reviewing drone footage streamed in live from overhead, images blurry with fog and interference, but still discernible enough to catch outlines. A narrow path cutting deeper into the woods, an old rail line overgrown with ivy, and most disturbingly, the faint outline of yet another structure, a rectangular form tucked beneath the canopy like a predator hiding in tall grass. "We have to go now," Ryan said, his voice low but ironclad with resolve, the kind of tone that didn't invite debate but was not born from arrogance, rather from clarity, the kind of clarity one only finds when there's nothing left to fear and nothing more to lose. Marissa didn't argue. She simply nodded, pulled a sidearm from her holster and checked the safety, her eyes harder than they'd been earlier that day, more focused, more resigned to what they might find. Lucky, as if sensing the shift in atmosphere, trotted forward again, never pulling on the leash Ryan now refused to clip on, always keeping just within reach, like a thread guiding them into the heart of the unknown. They followed the path in silence, accompanied only by 2 tactical officers, and the hum of static from a comlink that grew fainter the deeper they moved into the hollow. Trees loomed like ancient guardians, their branches forming a tunnel of darkness that seemed to swallow sound, light, and even time itself. At one point, Marissa whispered something. Ryan didn't catch it, and she didn't repeat it, but he saw her eyes dart to a carved symbol on a tree, the same triangle in circle they'd now seen too many times, and he knew whatever she'd said had something to do with her sister. They reached the building just after midnight. It wasn't like the others. It was larger, made not from scrap or lumber but from heavy timber and concrete, as though it had once been a legitimate structure, maybe an old train station or a storage facility for forestry workers, before it was abandoned, forgotten, and repurposed by the wrong hands. There were no lights, no sound, just a locked steel door and painted crudely in faded red across its surface, a series of numbers Ryan instantly recognized. Dates, birth dates, children's birth dates. No time for caution now. The officers breached the door quickly, their movements fluid, rehearsed, but inside there was no resistance, no ambush, only darkness, and the oppressive smell of mildew, gasoline, and something far less identifiable. Ryan moved first, flashlight beam cutting through dust and shadows, revealing a hallway that led to a series of rooms, each one stripped bare, save for bolts in the floor, shackles on the walls, and a few scattered belongings, a child's shoe, a hairbrush, a drawing etched into the concrete in chalk, the color faded but still visible, a sun, a tree, and a dog. Lucky stood perfectly still at the edge of that room, as if frozen in recognition, then slowly stepped inside, nose brushing the drawing as he let out a single, low whine that echoed off the walls like a prayer too long unsaid. It was the same drawing Ryan had seen in the trailer weeks ago. This wasn't just a continuation, it was the origin, the place where it all began. And in that moment, surrounded by shadows of suffering, whispers of innocence lost, and the unwavering presence of a dog that had guided him through every impossible twist of this nightmare. Ryan. That Mero wasn't the architect, just one of many tenants in a structure built by neglect, sustained by apathy, and exposed only through the loyalty of a creature no one had thought to follow. They had not just stumbled onto a criminal network, they had uncovered a system. And now, standing in the silence of its sanctum, they knew that bringing it down would take more than one night, more than one raid, more than even the heroism of a dog who refused to give up. But it had begun, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed the raid on the compound deep within the hollow, as investigators spread across 3 counties, tracing names from the notebook and chasing faint echoes of past crimes, wispy, Ryan found himself drifting between 2 realities, one shaped by the day-to-day obligations of police work, interviews, debriefings, and press statements, the other, quieter and more internal, show. A heaviness born from the knowledge that the evil they had uncovered had existed not in distant cities or foreign landscapes, but right there, just beyond the edge of his own patrol route, beneath the quiet canopy of trees he had always thought he knew. Though commendations were offered, though reporters branded him a hero, and children's advocacy groups sent thank you letters by the dozens, Ryan accepted each word with a practiced nod and a tired ease. If it could be called that, belonged to the dog who now slept curled at the foot of his bed each night, the one who had once been dismissed as a stray, a wanderer, an afterthought, and who had instead proven to be the compass they had all ignored for too long. Lucky had changed, though not in a way anyone could see on the surface. He still moved with quiet confidence, still watched the door each night with ears just slightly alert, still followed Ryan's say. But there was a calm in him now, a softness in the way he settled near the fireplace or laid his head in Eli's lap during the boys' weekly therapy sessions, as though some invisible knot inside him had finally loosened, some sacred duty fulfilled. And Eli, though scarred in ways that would take years to fully understand if ever, was beginning slowly to return to himself. At first it had been just fragments, the way he reached instinctively for Lucky's collar when frightened, the way his eyes lit up at the sight of sunlight filtering through a window, the quiet hum he made when drawing, always the same image, a house, a tree, and a dog. But over time, those fragments became more consistent, more coherent, and eventually gave way to words, cautious at first, then more fluid, and finally laughter, sharp, sudden bursts that made his mother cry in silence, hands over her mouth, not because she was sad, but because she'd feared she'd never hear that sound again. Ryan visited often, though not as an officer anymore. The case, now in federal hands, had grown beyond the limits of Pine Hollow, with names tied to missing children across state lines, coordinated raids uncovering safe houses and transit hubs previously dismissed as abandoned ruins. and indictments being prepared that stretched into circles of power far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. But Ryan, by choice, had stepped away from the center of it all, not out of defeat nor detachment, but because he had already walked through the fire, already stared into the hollow mouth of darkness, and now he knew his place was not in the war room, but in the quiet aftermath, helping rebuild what had been broken, one small moment at a time. On a particularly clear spring afternoon, he stood on a hill just outside town, overlooking a field where construction crews had begun to lay the foundation for a new trauma recovery center for children, funded in part by donations that had poured in after the story went national and named in honor of the children found in the hollow. At his side, Lucky sat calmly, tail flicking through the grass, his eyes following a group of volunteers planting a small garden just beside the site. Eli was there too, digging in the dirt with a wooden spade, a determined frown on his face as he pushed seeds into the earth with far more care than anyone his age should have learned to carry. But perhaps that too was healing. Ryan took a slow breath. He thought of the others, not just the 5 they had rescued, not just the 27 names in the ledger, but the ones whose fates were still unknown, the ones they might never find, the ones who would live on only through the symbols etched into wood, through the stories told by those who finally broke the silence. And he thought of Lucky, how easily the world might have overlooked him, how close they had come to never following his trail, how many moments had depended not on grand gestures or institutional efforts, but on one dog's quiet refusal to walk away from a child in the dark. There were no medals for that kind of bravery. There were no headlines big enough, but there was peace. And in the end, Ryan realized, peace doesn't always come with closure or clarity or even justice. Sometimes it comes in the form of a child's hand resting on a dog's back. Sometimes it comes in the sound of laughter, where once there had been only silence. And sometimes it comes when you realize that you were never the one leading, that the path had always been there, quietly waiting, if only you'd had the heart to follow.